laureate, symposiasts, distinguished guests. It is a great pleasure and an honor to welcome you all to the Holberg Symposium in honor of the 2024 Holberg Laureate Achille Mbembe. My name is Jørgen Sejersted, and I am the chair of the Holberg board. Each year, based on the recommendations of an international committee, the board awards the Holberg Prize to outstanding scholars in the humanities, social sciences, law, and theology. We are delighted to welcome those of you present here in the Aula, in Bergen, as well as those joining us via live stream from around the world. This symposium marks the beginning of this year's Holberg Week, where we offer a week of celebrations and several academic events with participation of eminent scholars. Established by the Norwegian government in 2003, the Holberg Prize honors the scientist and writer Ludvig Holberg, who lived from 1684 to 1754. The University of Bergen administers the prize on behalf of the Norwegian Ministry of Education and Research. For the Holberg Symposium, the laureate is invited to propose a topic, as well as the persons with whom he would like to converse. We look forward to taking part in the presentations and discussions during this year's symposium in honor of Achille Mbembe, who has chosen the timely topic, Democracy as a Community of Life. To present the laureate and the symposium speakers, I am pleased to hand over to the academic director of the Holberg Prize, Professor Bjørn Inge Bertelsen, who will moderate the event. So please, Bjørn, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Jørgen, and a very good morning to all of you here in beautiful but a bit rainy Bergen, in the University Aula, and to those joining us online. I am very pleased indeed to take on the task of moderating the Holberg Symposium in honor of the 2024 Holberg Laureate, Professor Achille Mbembe. We are also extremely pleased to have three excellent symposium speakers with us here in Bergen today, and we look forward to all of them sharing their insights with us on the topic, as Jørgen just pointed out, democracy as a community of life. This topic was selected by the laureate. The laureate and the three symposium speakers, Arto Quaison, Nasreen Allah, and Paul Gilroy, will all contribute to making sense of this topic, and we do really look forward to interventions from each and every one of them. But before we delve into the symposium topic, please let me introduce the 2024 Holberg Laureate, Professor Achille Mbembe, to you. Born in 1957, Achille Mbembe is Research Professor of History and Politics at the Wits Institute for Social and Economic Research, otherwise known as WISER, at the University of Witwatersrand, Johannesburg, South Africa. He is also the director of the Innovation Foundation for Democracy, which he founded. Educated in Cameroon and France, Mbembe earned his PhD from the Université Paris 1, Panthéon-Sorbonne, and a diplôme d'études approfondies from the Institut d'études politiques de Paris, also known as Sciences Po. Apologies for my French. Professor Mbembe has taught at various universities in the United States, including Columbia University, the University of Pennsylvania, the University of California at Berkeley and at Irvine, Yale University, Duke University, and Harvard University. A recipient of the Ernst Bloch Award, he's a member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences and a fellow of the British Academy. Mbembe holds honorary doctorates from the Paris 8 Université in France, the Catholic University of Louvain, and the University of Bergen here in Norway. His work has been translated into by now 18 languages across the globe. The Holberg Committee highlights that Mbembe is recognized as one of the foremost thinkers of post-colonial Africa and a leading critical theorist of the Planetary. He has significantly advanced the understanding of racism and its effects on subjectivity, particularly through the concept of the racial subject. Mbembe's rejection of all forms of racism is also inspired by the uneven impact of the climate crisis on the global south, a theme explored in his most recent work, Brutalism, from 2024. Mbembe's early research focused on colonial violence, African resistance, and struggles for independence. His work analyzed the nature of state power and led him to rethink the notion of the post-colony. His key books, many of which have been translated from French, include On the Post-Colony from 2001, Necropolitics from 2019, Out of the Dark Night from 2021, Brutalism from 2024, and The Earthly Community, Reflections on the Last Utopia from 2022. These works cover a broad range of themes, including the contradictions inherent in democracy, race, ethnicity, biopolitics, and identity politics within African states. The committee emphasizes the importance of Mbembe's groundbreaking work, Critique of Black Reason, a philosophical study of the historical emergence and meanings of blackness. It examines how the term black was used to dehumanize individuals in the interests of capital, showing how blackness was associated with being non-human or animal-like, thereby justifying the reproduction of oppressive and exploitative structures. Mbembe argues that some black critiques of race have implicitly reproduced the epistemology of racial difference. Recently, Mbembe's focus has shifted to contemporary developments in the colonial imperial world, the nature of late Eurocentrism, the impact of the Anthropocene, and the implications of artificial intelligence for humanity. The committee concludes that Mbembe's oeuvre goes beyond a particularized notion of decolonization to a universalist recentering of the human. This involves a commitment to facing historical truth and fostering and learning across South-North divides. By any standard, Professor Achille Mbembe's achievements are truly remarkable. It's therefore a great privilege for us to be able to organize this symposium in his honor today. I now give the floor to Professor Achille Mbembe, who will introduce the topic for the Holberg Symposium entitled Democracy as a Community of Life. Welcome, Professor Mbembe.
Thank you. First of all, I would like to thank the committee. The rector is here. My wife is here, Sarah. The children will join tomorrow. And a lot of my friends are here too, Wendy and Ian in particular. And of course, the speakers will be listening to in a moment. My dear brother Paul, my younger brother Atto, my younger sister Nasrim, and Bjorn and Ellen, who have been absolutely amazing in helping me to go through this moment. And I would like to thank you too for being here. As a matter of introduction to this morning's conversation, I would like, first of all, to highlight how difficult it is to express today in a single word the current direction of the world we live in, or even to comment on the current state of knowledge, how it is produced, how it circulates, and above all, who it serves. Why is it that difficult? It is that difficult because almost everywhere, in any case, in those parts of the world we come from, in Africa, the provisional tends to become permanent. Instability and uncertainty tend to turn structural, and dislocation is becoming somewhat the latest name of complexity. In such a context, it seems to me that to account for the state of the world clearly requires new forms of intelligence and new ways of convening disciplines. We need to ask ourselves what this singular moment in our history opens up as a possibility. What in our critical arsenal can still be used, and for what purpose? What in the same arsenal no longer works because the world around us has changed. It seems to me that it's only at the condition of tackling these questions that we might then, let's say, open up a space for the kind of thinking which paves the pathways of tomorrow. And to pave such pathways of tomorrow, obviously, we will need knowledge which is drawn from all the archives of the world, and not just one archive, all the archives of the world. That's the first point I wanted to put on the table as we are about to start this conversation. The second point has to do with what concerns some of us today the most. In any case, in places such as Africa or South Africa, for that matter. And here, I would say that what concerns me the most today is the techno-ecological situation of the planet. This might seem provocative for someone who lives and works in Africa, where basic questions of human survival, of hunger, disease, housing, education, possibility to move around, most of these questions are still, for the most part, unresolved. Yet, by the term, the techno-ecological situation of the planet today, what I am gesturing toward are indeed questions of livability, questions of habitability, those relating to the protection of the livelihoods, especially of the most vulnerable among us. What I'm gesturing towards are, of course, our relationships with the multiple living beings of which our Earth is composed. I have the feeling that today new journeys of thought are inevitably taking us to other shores. We now know that, for instance, fossil capitalism is based on an organization of relationships with nature that cuts humanity off from its vital relationships with other living beings. We understand how our existence is caught up in the fabric of lives with other humans and other species. We also now know that there is a cosmological dimension to ecology. In any case, in Africa, in ancient Africa in particular, in ancient African cosmogonies, I mean, economy and ecology were always synonymous. And most myths attest to the tenacity of life on Earth, but also to the great fragility of ecosystems. Certainly because ancient Africans knew that they all depended almost entirely on other living beings to reproduce the material conditions of their existence. So if you want, the idea, the project is to summon all of these archives, reassemble them, and redecipher them in an attempt at eliciting the conditions for the pursuit of life on our planet today, in the belief that the question of futures of life, insofar as these futures of life are related to another deep, serious question, the question of the futures of reason and of techne, these will be indeed some of the key philosophical challenges of this century. That's why I think with technology now mobilizing both atomic and a growing number of molecules of biological origin or human synthesis, a new geopolitics of energy, minerals, biology, and even food and health will inevitably emerge. And in that context, Africa still has a role to play. And it might well be that place on our planet where a part of our future is being played out. All of which leads me then to a last remark, which has to do with what Paul Gilroy called, not so long ago, planetary humanism, which some of us now translate into planetary consciousness, which is not the equivalent of either universalism or cosmopolitanism, which is about realizing that the planet is everywhere, that it is at the same time unique and finite, that it is about the interdependent relationships between human beings and natural environments, and the fact that the representation of the world and the planet as the Earth with capital E somewhat should lead to a refunding of the law, starting with international law. It seems to me, and I'll end there, that such a new legal imagination should definitely rest on the obligation not only to share this planet, but also to care for it, to repair it, all of this as a precondition for its sustainability, its durability, and ours as well. So those were the remarks I wanted to share with you before now we all sit down and listen to Atto, to Paul, and to Nasrin. Thank you very much once again.
Thank you very much, Professor Mbembe. We now move, as Mbembe said, to the symposium speakers, who have all been recommended by the laureate. Each speaker has been asked to prepare, excuse me, bad weather in Bergen. Each speaker has been asked to prepare a 20-minute presentation reflecting on the theme. The first speaker this morning is Professor Arto Quaison. Arto Quaison is the Jean G. and Maurice M. Doyle Professor of Interdisciplinary Studies and English Chair of the Department of African and African American Studies at Stanford University. He was educated at the University of Ghana and at Cambridge University, where he took his PhD. Professor Quaison has a background from the University of Ghana, where he took his undergraduate degree before pursuing a PhD from the University of Cambridge. Thereafter, he has held numerous posts at both Oxford University and Cambridge University, as well as having been a professor of African and post-colonial literature at the New York University, and a professor of English and inaugural director of the Center for Diaspora and Transnational Studies at the University of Toronto. In 2016, he was appointed university professor at the University of Toronto, the highest distinction that the university can bestow. Highly relevant in this regard is also the fact that Professor Quaison has served as the president of the African Studies Association. He's also an elected fellow of the Ghana Academy of Arts and Sciences, the Royal Society of Canada, the British Academy, and of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. Professor Quaison publishes widely and has 6 monographs and 10 edited volumes to his name, among which is the fantastic book Oxford Street, Accra, City Life, and the Itineraries of Transnationalism, which came out in 2014. The book has won several awards, including being listed as one of The Guardian's 10 best books about cities in 2014. Quaison is also a very active communicator and curates the YouTube channel Critic Reading Writing, as well as being the host of Contours, the Cambridge Literary Studies Hour. The enticing title of his presentation today is The Sorcerer's Thread, Interspecies Ontologies. Professor Quaison, the floor and microphone is yours.
Thank you, Bjorn. Thanks Achille for including me in this, what promises to be an intellectual feast. And congratulations again. I've changed my title. And the current title is Delirious Sovereignty, Notes from Amos to Tuola. Today, I want to share some preliminary reflections on a concept I'm going to call delirious sovereignty, something that seems to me pertinent to understanding the actions of many polities in Africa today, but also from other parts of the world, such as the UK after Brexit and in the US during Trump's presidency. As I shall show, delirious sovereignty far transcends any of these examples. This is because its roots lie in forms of excess that tip the rational over into the delirious, and at the same time corrals it into the logic of governance and the disposition of political arrangements. Delirious sovereignty is as absurd as it is real. But to fully grasp its momentous duality, I would like to turn to the work of Amos Tutuola, and specifically his novel, My Life in the Bush of Ghosts. I deliberately chose Tutuola to exemplify the general lineaments of delirious sovereignty, because I know that Achille Mbembe shares with me an abiding fascination with his work. And coincidentally, My Life in the Bush of Ghosts was published in 1957, the year of Achille's birth. Indeed, it is partly in dialogue with a piece that Achille wrote on Tutuola some 20 years ago titled Life, Sovereignty, and Terror in Amos Tutuola that I want to set up my remarks. I take Achille's piece to have been a preliminary laying out of some of the key terms and concepts, and have been waiting eagerly for when he might return to the subject to provide us with a fuller account. Perhaps my reflections today will prompt such a return. When I wrote on Amos Tutuola myself many years ago in Strategic Transformations in Nigerian Writing, my main concern was with how he demonstrated the Yoruba cultural matrix, and out of which emerged the aesthetic orientations of the historian Samuel Johnson and the writers Wole Soyinka, Ben Okri, and of course, Tutuola himself. Regarding Tutuola, my effort at the time was to make sense of his extraordinarily fecund esoteric imagination, which had clearly been shaped from being steeped in the Yoruba tradition of cautionary folk tales, primarily aimed at children, and which Tutuola had forged into a distinctive narrative genre. At the time, I had an eye to how he had impacted Ben Okri's own novels, specifically The Famish Road. Whereas in Okri's novel, the crossing of boundaries between the real and the esoteric domains is not demarcated and can happen at any time and without the conscious agency of the young Azaro, in Tutuola's My Life in the Bush of Ghosts, the entry and exit of the 7-year-old first-person narrator into and out of the Bush of Ghosts are clearly demarcated in terms both of specific landmarks and of the child's own consciousness of crossing the boundaries. I have now come to see that the earlier reading of thresholds was not supple enough, since in fact there are various thresholds that the young boy traverses that are not just spatial but ontological as well. Furthermore, I have now added to the dimension of spatial traversals the larger and much more complicated question of anamorphism, which in this instance I'm going to explore primarily from the perspective of space, but that raises temporal and ontological implications as well. The easiest way to grasp spatial anamorphism is with reference to science fiction and fantasy. Typically, in science fiction and fantasy, anamorphism is most readily seen in the distortions of space-time coordinates, such that an innocent-looking door in a bedroom, when first opened, might reveal the twinkling galaxy. Closed and opened again, it might reveal a bustling street in Bergen. And if closed and opened again, only the cat yawning under a leafy mango tree in the tropical backyard. The point to bear in mind is that anamorphism reveals the struggle between the limits of visible boundaries and the extension of poetic abstraction of both space and time. Space and time are textured in ways that render them actively participant in the simultaneous wrinkling and unfolding of reality. Thus, time might also become viscous or take on the form of sudden sentience. In one extraordinarily suggestive instance of anamorphism in My Life in the Bush of Ghosts, the young boy is desperate to escape some ghosts that are intent on capturing him. The trope of potential captivity and escape from it are repeated incessantly throughout the narrative, so that this instance is just one in a long cycle. In this particular case, the boy runs into a part of the bush to escape from the pursuing ghost, but realizes, to his utmost horror, that the earth can talk. But to my surprise, at that same moment that I put my left foot on it to be still running away, it was saying thus with a loud voice, "Don't smash me. Oh, don't smash me. Don't walk on me. Go back to those who are chasing you to kill you. It is paining me too much as you are smashing me." When I heard this so suddenly, I was so frightened that I withdrew my foot back at once, and I heard no voice again. After that, I turned to another part and smashed it again with the same foot as well. Perhaps that part would not cry. But I heard the same caution suddenly with louder voice, so I withdrew my foot from it. Then I stopped there and asked myself this question: can land talk like a human being, or can land feel pain if somebody smashes it? The uncanny experience persists when, on continuing to run through the patch of ground, the voice of the earth is replaced with that of a very loud siren or blowing alarm, as we are told in the story. It is as if now the earth is not so much in pain, that the earth is in so much pain that it activates an ambulance siren as a way to invoke the very principle of care that has been abandoned in its being trampled upon. But the question that the boy asked about whether the earth can feel what is done to it is absolutely critical, because not only are we exposed to the possibility that the earth does indeed feel pain and protests against it without our knowing, but that the young boy acquires awareness about precisely this possibility. This is one of the many installments of interspecies ontologies that Tutuola delivers to us. Another dimension of interspecies ontologies is to be seen in the many metamorphoses that the boy undergoes, always involuntary and against his will. Typically, these metamorphoses are tied to being placed in different forms of bondage by the grotesque spirits that he encounters during his traversal in the bush. At one point, a bunch of ghosts carry him to the 9th town of ghosts, change him into a blind man, and after torturing him a while, lock him up in a doorless room. This doorless room happens to be filled with 1,000 snakes, the largest of which vomits out some colored lights that light up all parts of the room. This slimy invocation of the full perspectival sensorium, so the flashing lights and the tactile creeping on the skin. Then, in that space, is then suddenly transformed into a complete anamorphic threshold. The snakes disappear, and immediately after, he sees that the doorless room has changed into a pitcher, and that he is unexpectedly trapped inside of this pitcher. Simultaneously, his neck elongates to about 3 feet long, and his head becomes so big that his long neck can barely carry it. 2 large eyes as big and round as footballs appear on each side of this head, and both eyes can easily turn in any direction. In addition, he sprouts wings and a long beak. The boy has become a bird with a pitcher for his body. Things become even more strange when the ghosts mistake him for a god and offer him food sacrifices. Unfortunately, however, anytime he tries to eat the food, his beak shrinks so that he can only peck at it. Several things have taken place in this story segment. To start with, the room with the snakes in which he is originally held captive is thoroughly anamorphic because the snakes vanish only for the space itself to transform into a pitcher, the complete opposite of a room. So the room transforms into a pitcher. The snakes vanish only for the space itself to transform into a pitcher and trap him inside of it. In this spatial transformation, the young boy is thoroughly the victim of a constrained embodiment. So captivity and constrained embodiment are repeated throughout the novel. Given that every ghost he encounters in the bush is a grotesque and strange figure, this can only mean that his composite nature, comprising the head and feathers of a bird, the body of a man-made pitcher, and the body of a man-made pitcher, makes him more anomalous than any of the other spirit ghosts, and thus, ironically, the object of their reverence and worship. We wouldn't be going too far in seeing this God in the Picture episode as Tutuola's peculiarly original reflection on hybrid ontological states, something that is featured repeatedly within the narrative. For in this particular instance, he's not only reflecting on the nature of divine being and suggesting that the divine may itself be eager to escape its own divinity so as to satisfy some basic and indeed banal human needs, but that the divine may itself be a composite of contingent ontologies, contingent and contrasting ontologies. In this case, encapsulated in the amalgam of a bird with eyes like a football, a man-made pitcher, etc. The ghosts that come to worship what they take to be a divine being are clearly mistaken, since it is only its extraordinary interspecies anomalousness that elevates it above all other creatures, and not the fact that it possesses any special divine qualities. More importantly, in this episode, the spatial anamorphism, the room turning into a picture, is inextricably tied to the principle of fluid interspecies metamorphoses, so that it is not just space that is anamorphic, but also the very principle of being an ontology. The key to understanding this particular episode of my life in the Bush of Ghosts is that space and ontology are coincident and indeed inseparable in their mutual constitution. Almost 3 decades ago, the venerable and otherwise flawless Frederick Jameson opined in an essay titled Third World Literature in the Era of Multinational Capitalism that all Third World literature was a form of political allegory. Jameson got himself into a bit of a pickle with that one. For as can be imagined, this generalization did not go down too well with postcolonial scholars. And yet I think that the flaw in Jameson's argument was not so much in its over-hasty generalization, the all, which completely undid his argument, but rather that his model of interpretation was not supple enough to include contrastive forms of literature in both realist fiction and fantastic literature. For the challenge, I think, is to prove the workings of the terms of a political allegory with texts that seem completely uncompromising in that regard. In other words, it's easy to read political allegory from realist literature, which is what he did. Now, I cannot think of a text more recalcitrant to a political allegorical reading than My Life in the Bush of Ghosts. After all, it seems to simply be the picaresque story of a young boy lost in a bush of spirits and doing everything in his power to return to his family. There is no mention of the nation state in the story, either directly or indirectly, and definitely not of his own Nigeria at the threshold of independence a mere 6 years after the publication of the work. So the work was published in 1957. They won a mere 4 years, sorry. To convert Tutuola's novel into a political allegory, a number of procedures have to be undertaken. First is to understand what kind of plot structure the book represents. In this regard, we may handily divide African literature into 2 distinct plot structures. First is the plot of propulsion, exemplified most significantly by Chinua Achebe's Things Fall Apart, but also to be seen in works by Sembène Osman, Ngugi wa Thiong'o, Najib Mahfouz, and also Nnedi Okorafor and Amata Edo, among others. The second type of plot is the plot of inertia, where nothing seems to happen at all. Good examples of this plot of inertia can be found in Dambujo Marecheri's The House of Hunger, Aikwe Amer's The Beautiful Ones Are Not Yet Born, Alain Mabanko's Broken Glass, and Fiston Mwanza Mujila's Tram 83, among others. Tutola's novel is distinctive in that it is an exquisite condensation of both types of plot structure. On the one hand, it is clearly propulsive in that the young boy is doing everything to get back home and does so by stumbling through numerous adventures, with each stage seeming to take him closer to his final objective. And yet, at the same time, the narrative is also one of extreme inertia, since what Vladimir Prop would refer to as the actants of the story are repeatedly of the same kind, and the scenarios in which they enact their menace are endlessly analogous to one another. Now, what is more semblative of the African post-colony than this combination of propulsiveness and inertia in equal measure? Not only that, and even more uncannily, African countries seem to mirror each other in their essential realities, no matter how different they are in size and intent. Take Nigeria, some 64 years after independence, and South Africa, 30 years after the fall of apartheid. For most observers of African politics, Jacob Zuma would have been perfectly at home as president of Nigeria. In fact, one might even argue that South Africa is undergoing not a renaissance, as was once touted by Thabo Mbeki, but a veritable Nigerianization of their political economy. And even South Africa's periodic attempts at purging fellow Africans from different parts of the continent from among their midst might be said to be drawn from the same reservoir of anger and frustration that have animated Nigeria's Boko Haram. In both instances, it is extremely disaffected youth that feel that they have no hope for the future, who then come to identify outsiders to be violently purged and punished, all the while with a nervous glance at the national political leadership to see if they will do anything to mitigate their own suffering and disillusionment. Achille makes an observation in his paper on Tutuola that is further pertinent to any attempt at a political analogical interpretation of My Life in the Bush of Ghosts. Most commentators on Lacan's essay on the mirror stage interpret it as pertaining to the quest for self-completion in the face of the persistent deferral encoded in the spectral reflection caught in the mirror. But Achille adds two elements that I think are much more fascinating. I quote Achille here: "There is, in fact, no reflection in the mirror without a certain distribution of things in proximity and distance, a certain manner of playing light against darkness and vice versa. Without such interplay, there can be no manifestation of the double." And furthermore, this time echoing Jean-Pierre Vernant, Achille writes, "The mirror opens a breach in the backdrop of phenomena, displays the invisible, and lets it be seen in the brilliance of a mysterious epiphany. Thus, the causal induction of the self is demonstrated in Tutola's novel as being the product of a breach in self-regard, as opposed to self-regard in terms of seeing, as opposed to estimation, and in the emergence in relation to that self-regarding self of phenomena that have never been quite anticipated. It involves the evolution of a series of epiphanies of negation, and indeed of doubling and unresolvable contradiction. This breach is a persistent feature of what Salman Rushdie has described in another context as the national longing for form, which since the swath of countries coming to independence in Africa in the 1960s has been ambushed by surprising forms of ethnocentrisms manifest as the inventions of tradition from within the spectral time space of the nation state. No African I can think of accepts the designation of being a tribalist. Tribalism is what other less enlightened people do. And yet ethnocentrism has more than once become the means of negotiating access to the nation space, whether through genocidal wars, as in Rwanda and Sierra Leone, or as the means for establishing the terms of necropolitical power upon different categories of ethnicities, as in Achille's own Cameroon, or simply as the informal yet sacrosanct and agreed upon means of dividing up presidential power, as is still embarrassing the case in Nigeria. So these are the breaches in the mirror of self-regard. Running quickly out of time, let me zero in on a scene, another point about the allegorization, and which is the repeated threat of being, and I'm citing a scene from Tutola here, of being transparented. This occurs early in the novel when a silver ghost shines its light upon him, and it makes him see all his the bones in his body. Basically, it's a reflection on the X-ray. Now, this threat of being transparented is also analogous to a certain threat that African polities feel, especially from the international financial agencies and also from European entities, because there's always a threat of being transparented. Now, all these clustered together lead to different forms of delirious sovereignty in terms of a hyper-energized form of control born out of legitimation anxieties. So born out of legitimation anxieties, born out of the repeated response to the colonial template, which has not gone away. Also born from the incoherence, the inherent incoherence of the nation-state form internally, economically, socially, and so on. So very quickly, I wanted to add that delirious sovereignty is also applicable not just to Africa, but also to Europe and North America. In brief, the reasons for this particular delirium in the UK and the US are quite different than in Africa, but common to both polities is the idea that they are under siege from outside forces on the one hand, but also that the terms of social cohesion that held their societies together are being undermined by racial minorities and also alternative lifestyles from the inside. The combination of siege and the threatened dissolution of social glue is what leads on the one hand to the EU's demonization by Britain and the US's insistent demonization of China and also Russia, and at the same time, of the persecution of the Black Lives Matter movement and of DEI initiatives in both countries. And they do this by erecting what amounts to a distorted carnivalesque effigy of critical race studies that they attack with great fear and vehemence. In other words, the idea of being besieged. And there are historical reasons why these very powerful Euro-American countries feel a sense of besieged, come from both inside and outside, and this leads to different forms of delirious sovereignty. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Professor Otto Quaison. The next speaker in the symposium is Nasreen Ola. Nasreen Ola is assistant professor jointly appointed in English and African American and African Studies at the University of Virginia. A South African scholar, Nasreen completed her undergraduate degree at the University of Cape Town and her PhD in the literatures at the English department at Cornell University. She specializes in African and African diasporic literature, post-colonial theory, and continental philosophy. She is working on her first book project, The Right to Opacity, which engages with the theme of alterity across a range of contemporary African and African diasporic literatures. In 2020, the right to opacity was awarded Cornell University's Guilford Prize for the best dissertation that year. Nasreen's research has been supported by a number of fellowships and institutions, including the Mellon Mays Fellowship, the A.W. Mellon Fellowship at the Society for the Humanities, Cornell University, and the Charlotte W. Newcomb Dissertation Completion Fellowship. In 2021, Nasreen was named one of the top 200 young South Africans by the Mail and Guardian. In 2023, she was awarded the New Literary History's Ralph Cohen's Prize for her essay, The Exhausted, Fred Moten's Poetics. Dr. Olla's works spans an enormous array of thoughts, philosophies, and literatures. And she has written and researched, for instance, Edwidge Danticat, Fred Moten, M. Nourbez Philippe, Diane Brand, Claudia Rankin, Frantz Fanon, Susan Buck Morse, Gayatri Spivak, Denise Riley, Judith Butler, and Simone de Beauvoir. And last but not least, this year's Holberg Prize laureate Achille Mbembe. The title of our presentation today is The Body in Flight. Dr. Olla, the floor and microphone is yours.
So, firstly, I'd like to thank the organizers of the symposium, Bjorn and Ellen, for all their efforts in bringing us together today. And I'd also like to express how happy I am to participate in a symposium in celebration of Achille Mbembe's work. Reading Achille's work on everything from the critical power of musical traditions in the Congo to the role of the inanimate in pre-colonial cultures, the death worlds of colonialism, the life worlds of African literature has taught me an enormous amount. So I'm very pleased to be here today celebrating Achille's many contributions. So, the invitation of this symposium asks us to think about democracy as a project committed to sustaining life. In our neoliberal and digital age, the project of democracy faces many challenges, from the devaluation of public goods to the replacement of the citizen with a vision of human capital. At the same time, across the globe, we face a rapidly changing climate, which requires that we think about how our actions are interconnected with multiple forms of life. The task that seems urgent is one of the imagination, one in which we collectively reassess the philosophical, political, and aesthetic traditions that can offer us concepts, models, and examples of communities of life and diverse understandings of personhood that exceed a market-orientated and anthropocentric frame. Where to look for such resources? In the 20th century, the great struggles against dehumanization, against patriarchy, racism, colonialism, class discrimination, have frequently sought to transform our conception of the human, to create the foundation of what Aimé Césaire called a true humanism, a humanism made to the measure of the world. This humanism would be made up not of divisions between genders, races, and classes, but a total transformation of our ideas of collectivity, community, and identity. Today, it seems important to ask, did the anti-racist and feminist projects of the 20th century simply expand upon an anthropocentric vision of the human, or did they reach for a new vision of the human? Did they reach for a vision of the human that belongs to what we might call a community of life? Another way to ask this question would be, how do we think about the inaugurating insights of feminism and anti-racism today? What I want to do in this presentation, then, is to look at two influential philosophers of the 20th century, Frantz Fanon and Simone de Beauvoir, to think about the resources found in this tradition that might help us imagine democratic forms made up not simply of men and women, black humanity and white humanity, but an expanded vision of personhood. I want to focus my attention on the way Beauvoir and Fanon move away from a politics grounded in identity and try to imagine new ways of nourishing solidarity across difference. My sense is that while Beauvoir and Fanon are seen as traditional humanists, implicit in their thinking is a commitment to a transformed vision of cohabitation and relation that I'll seek to make explicit. Simone de Beauvoir and Frantz Fanon wrote their major philosophical works in the aftermath of the Second World War. Both took the abstracted insights of existentialism, a philosophy committed to freedom and self-actualization, and explored conditions of gender, race, and colonialism. Fanon asked, how does the colonial situation wound, confuse, and limit the mental and bodily capacities of the colonized? How does racism create an unreality that blinds? Beauvoir asked, how does one become a woman? Why does this becoming a woman throw one into scenes of submission, passivity, and bad faith? At its heart, both Fanon and Beauvoir's writing can be read as a study of non-relation. They explored the complex ways relation is stalled, paralyzed, and rendered impossible in patriarchal, racist, and colonial settings. They sought in their writing and activism to imagine what conditions would need to be transformed in order to nourish genuine relation. It is difficult to believe that The Second Sex was written 75 years ago, as its insights continue to be relevant today. In an interview, Beauvoir describes writing The Second Sex not as a process of passing on well-established knowledge, but as a moment of great self-discovery. I became aware for the first time that I was leading a false life, Beauvoir says, or rather that I was profiting from this male-orientated society without even knowing it. What had happened is that quite early in my life, I had accepted male values and was living accordingly. Thus, for Beauvoir, The Second Sex was an occasion to reflect on what it has meant to be called a woman throughout the ages, and to show how this history is not dead and gone, but shapes the possibilities and limitations of the present. In The Second Sex, Beauvoir began by exploring the myths and fantasies projected onto women. These myths are as strange as they are diverse. They range from a vision of a monstrous female, which remains close to nature, to a vision of the female as possessing a caring nature. Beauvoir then sought to show how these myths play out in the lives of women, the way they open some social positions and limit others, the way they create certain kinds of evasions and absences. In these descriptions, Beauvoir is attempting not to accurately represent all women's experience or all the positions they might hold, nor is she attempting to show how women's situation is impossible to escape. Rather, Beauvoir attempts to show how when identity becomes destiny, it can no longer support freedom, exchange, and cohabitation. What does it mean for an identity to become a destiny? In everyday language, we use the word destiny to refer to something that seems predetermined, given, and natural. We use the word to refer to an event that appears to be set in motion by hidden forces or timed perfectly. What Beauvoir discovers in writing The Second Sex is that women's lives are given a shape, a function, and a role in society that comes to look like a destiny. Patriarchal oppression is not simply about disappearing women or erasing their lives, but about inscribing their lives into a particular narrative that can be known in advance. These narratives are not all identical and change across time. Sometimes they're about motherly capacity, a familiarity with the domestic realm, and at other times they're about a monstrous body and a proximity to chaotic forms of nature. This kind of excessively inscribed life or social destiny severely limited a woman's capacity to live a life that was of her own making. 3 years after the publication of The Second Sex, Fanon publishes his first major book, Black Skin, White Masks. Fanon had fought in the Second World War for the Free France forces, and his first book carries this sense of disappointment at the relentlessness of the racism felt both in the war and in its aftermath. Like Beauvoir, Fanon discovers the perils and tortures of an identity that becomes a destiny. One way of reading Black Skin, White Mask is as a book that charts the difficulty of love in a racialized context. Fanon takes us to a novel that charts the breakdown of love between a black French man and a white French woman, or in another moment, a memoir that shows the facileness of a relation between a black woman and a white man. Fanon shows how each of these characters seek each other out and wish to build a relation in freedom, but cannot see the other because what they encounter is a racial fantasy. They do not see a person, but myths of white beauty or black wretchedness. Fanon shows how the racialized subject cannot see themselves clearly and must tortuously ask, where do these racial myths end and I begin? Am I the way I am because of my race? Or is my race the way it is because I am the way I am? At what point can I say I am this way because I am this way? 1 year after the publication of Black Skin, White Mask, Fanon takes up a position as a psychiatrist in Algeria. The War of Independence in Algeria was one of the most violent and cruel, with the routine use of torture. As a psychiatrist, Fanon treated both the colonized and the colonizer, the torturer and the tortured, and saw firsthand the brute force of colonialism. One of the insightful arguments which is present in Black Skin, White Mask and becomes even more clear in The Wretched of the Earth is how when identity becomes destiny, its victims become reactionary. Fanon observed that when his patients were subject to colonial violence, which first consisted of seeing the colonized as dispensable life or as the life that was given the destiny of wretchedness, then action that resists this violence tends at first to be purely reflexive. Fanon writes, in the colonial world, the colonized affectivity is kept on edge like a running sore. The psyche retracts, is obliterated, and finds an outlet through muscular spasms that have caused many an expert to classify the colonized as hysterical. For Fanon, a key part of the project of decolonization is about the colonized stripping away the unreality projected onto their bodies and finding a way to replace chaotic forms of bodily reaction with forms of collective action. This sense of the reactionary dimension of the alienated body echoes in Beauvoir's writing. Whether considering the male gaze, the circular labor of housework, or the personas of motherhood, Beauvoir emphasizes how women must constantly confront the heavy weight of being cast as inessential. This requires that women spend much time reacting to the world's suffocating gaze rather than acting on the world. The feminist project for Beauvoir is about setting up conditions through which an acting body can be brought to life. Both Fanon and Beauvoir imagine this new body pursued through projects of disalienation. This new body would not be one defined by one destiny, but committed to projects, pursuits, and drives that could not be known in advance. The question we ought to ask when reading Fanon and Beauvoir today is, what vision of personhood emerges out of their critique? Does Beauvoir imagine a non-binary body emerging at the moment when the myth of woman has been unveiled? Does Fanon imagine a space in which race falls away to make room for other forms of relation? Where, in other words, does the vision of identity beyond destiny take us? To answer these questions, I want to turn to three concepts in Fanon and Beauvoir's thought. All of these concepts emerge out of their critique of a fixing, paralyzing, and suffocating effect, the fixing, paralyzing, and suffocating effect of identity as destiny. The first concept is that of relation. In both their work, there is an emphasis not on isolated identities, but on forms of relation and non-relation between bodies, spaces, inanimate objects, animate objects, life worlds, and death worlds. The second concept, which is implied by the first, is of a body in flight. Fanon and Beauvoir pay less attention to what a body represents and more to how a body can and cannot move in the world, what capacities it does and does not possess. And the last is The last concept I will consider is the way their work produces situated knowledge, which is not intent on creating theories that can be applied across time and space, but instead privileges contextualized forms of thinking and writing. Taken together, these three concepts give us a sense of what is at stake in taking up the project of Fanon and Beauvoir today. Contemporary readers of Fanon have debated whether we find a deeply pessimistic view of the world in his writing or a latently optimistic view of the world. Some readers, like Frank Wilderson, find in Fanon a conception of blackness as a form of social death that is both unending and exceptional. On the other hand, Fred Moten, in a longer reflection on Fanon's writing, has argued that latently concealed in Fanon's project is a vision not only of wretchedness, but also the capacity of black critique to exhaust the possible and nurture countercultural forms. On my reading, Fanon's project stands somewhere in between the Afro-pessimist and Afro-optimist position. While it is certainly true that we find an outraged critique of social death throughout Fanon's work, we also find a lifelong commitment to bringing life, vitality, and dynamism into colonial settings. To understand this latter part of the project, the concept of relation is useful. Take, for example, Fanon's way of understanding the hospital, healing, and psychiatry in Algeria. Fanon did not think of his patients as suffering from mental ailments that were primarily rooted in biology or primarily the result of an individual family dynamic. Rather, Fanon developed a more capacious view of his patients that saw them imbricated and interconnected in social, institutional, and political contexts. He traced the way they were alienated by colonial forms of non-relation and sought repair through various kinds of experiments. In A Dying Colonialism, Fanon writes of how the colonized sees the hospital as a space administered by strangers. Hospitals in colonial worlds were not spaces people trusted, but were frequently run by doctors who saw the colonized as less than human. For Fanon, it was not possible to treat patients without transforming the space of the hospital. To this end, Fanon not only worked one-on-one with patients, but tried to bring indigenous culture into the hospital. Fanon's many experiments included filling the hospital with local musical performances, visits by local storytellers, hosting screenings of films that resonated with the surrounding culture, creating social spaces like a cafe where patients could encounter one another with a sense of freedom, play, and spontaneity. Many of Fanon's patients suffered because they lived in colonial settings which made it impossible for them to either relate to themselves or those around them. The hospital then had to become a space where relation between doctor and patient, hospital and home, psyche and society could be nourished, where the non-relational strategies of colonial care could be replaced with the relational capacities of experimental psychiatry. I want to now briefly turn to Beauvoir's appositional account of relation. Contemporary readers of The Second Sex have expressed concern about the representation of the masculine identified body as free and liberated throughout the book. These readers have rightly asked, is anyone truly free in a patriarchal situation? Iris Young, in her essay Throwing Like a Girl, has argued that Beauvoir seems to represent the female body as almost essentially unfree because of particular physical characteristics. In the early pages of The Second Sex, Beauvoir, expanding upon Hegel's dialectic, imagines a fictional philosophical scene that expresses how woman becomes the other. Beauvoir imagines a masculine subject facing a stone and finding no solace there. This subject is unable to reflect his image onto the stone and therefore seeks out a different kind of object, namely an object that will remain an object, that is to say, something whose nature can in part be fixed or known in advance, but nonetheless provides a kind of companionship, that is to say, something that is alive and dynamic. Beauvoir writes of this subject as one who dreams of restlessness in restfulness in restlessness, of an opaque plenitude that consciousness would nevertheless still inhabit. This embodied dream is precisely woman, both foreign to man and peer, a subject who could be seen as naturally submissive consciousness. For Beauvoir, this is the hidden non-relation that the name woman comes to signify. Men and women are not, on Beauvoir's account, free in this dynamic. Freedom is not a state of rest where one finds comfort in the myth of a static other, but a state of encountering the other whom we cannot fix or shape to our own desires. For Beauvoir, identities are not inherently good or bad, and bodies are not inherently free or unfree. Rather, the question of freedom is always relational. On my reading, this emphasis on relation implies a conception of the body that does not stand alone, but becomes coherent in relation to other bodies, things, institutions, environments. We find here a body in flight. Some of these bodily flights are torturous, like the flight between man seeking rest and woman finding herself as an object, or in Fanon, white society seeking an object of horror in the black man, and the black man finding himself becoming this object. Other bodily flights proliferate connections and capacities, such as bodies that re-enter the social through Fanon's clinical experiments. In both Beauvoir and Fanon, the move from identity to relation is also a move from a philosophy focused on being to one focused on becoming. Beauvoir asks, how does one become a woman? And if one is not a woman but became one, then what else can one become? What other gendered and racial configurations might the future hold? These are open questions for Beauvoir and Fanon. The last aspect of Fanon and Beauvoir's writing that is striking is the move from the universal to situated modes of thought. Rather than seek out philosophical coherence across time and space, Beauvoir and Fanon invite their readers to find their own relation to concepts, methods, and examples on offer in their work. This form of reasoning does not offer ready-made solutions and gives up on the dream of perfected universalism. It is a form of critique that remains agile, adaptable, and strategic. Achille Mbembe has aptly called this form of thought metamorphic. So, by way of conclusion, I want to return to the questions I began with, which is, what vision of personhood do we find in these philosophers' work? Is it anthropocentric? Does it help us imagine a community of life? I think it's clear that we find the groundwork in Beauvoir and Fanon for what will later become the post-human philosophy of writers like Edouard Glissant or Deleuze and Guattari. Beauvoir and Fanon start to develop concepts that move us away from a human-centric vision to one in which multiple forms of life are interacting with one another. Their focus on relation and non-relation rather than identity and erasure is crucial. It invites us to consider how who we are is always the sum of relational networks we live in. It also invites us to analyze at what points, willingly or unwillingly, we fall into states of alienation, and what the effects of this alienation are on us and the world around us. The concept of the body in flight draws our attention away from proper names and proper uses of the body toward capacities and incapacities. Okay, so I think I'm going to stop there. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Dr. Ola. Our third and last speaker today is Professor Paul Gilroy. Paul Gilroy is currently Professor of the Humanities at University College London. Born in London, Gilroy has taught at a range of universities and written widely on matters of culture, politics, history, music, and art. He's founding director of UCL's Sarah Parker Remond Center for the Study of Racism and Racialization. Gilroy was awarded the Holberg Prize in 2019. Undoubtedly, Professor Paul Gilroy is one of the world's leading post-colonial intellectuals. Since the 1980s, he has offered incisive critique of both race thinking and racism, and has broken new ground in our thinking about difference as such. Works such as There Ain't No Black in the Union Jack, The Cultural Politics of Race and Nation from 1987, The Black Atlantic, Modernity and Double Consciousness from 1993, and Against Race, Imagining Political Culture Beyond the Color Line from 2001, have become reference points for the post-colonial scholarly canon on race and racism. I also think it's worthwhile quoting here an excerpt from the Holberg Committee's citation in 2019 when Professor Gilroy received the prize. I quote, "Paul Gilroy is one of the most challenging and inventive figures in contemporary scholarship. His work has influenced and, in some cases, reshaped several fields and subfields, including cultural studies, critical race studies, sociology, history, anthropology, and African American studies. He is a preeminent scholar of modernity's counterhistory, as well as the relationship of modernity, overdevelopment, and underdevelopment in the Black Atlantic world. Gilroy's scholarship continues to set the terms for investigation and study, not only in these areas, but also the role of racial and ethnic hierarchies in the production of colonialism in nations, the diasporic relations of exchange and circulation, the social formations they produce, and the cultures they generate." End of quote. Today, Professor Paul Gilroy will give a presentation entitled "Red, Black, and Green: Greening Black Traditions." Professor Paul Gilroy, it is a pleasure to have you here again, and the floor is yours.
Väl, jag hade aldrig trott jag skulle komma tillbaka hit igen. Democracy is under attack. Rampant neo-fascism, apocalyptic populism, authoritarian statism, deepening economic inequality, and the trashing of multinational institutions, particularly legal institutions, mean that people who have only ever been democracy's partial or occasional beneficiaries have to lend our voices to its defense, as well as to its transformation into something self-consciously multifaceted, something that might give the multinationalism required by the climate emergency and the proliferation of war a new currency. And this is why I applaud Achille's advocacy of a universal right to breathe, and his creative projection of new ways to imagine and to represent the world we inhabit under a common damaged roof. I just thought I would show this from 1947 to suggest a certain situational framing for Achille's project. Here, as far as I know, the first representation of the world in the tradition from which we speak to you, and Africa, as you can see, is highlighted there. My voice today refracts Africa's diasporic lives from the other side of the Middle Passage, a place that's been defined by long-standing traditions of estrangement from the exclusionary force of color-coded democracy. And I worry that the category of personhood may not be capacious enough to mediate the being of humans and other varieties of life lived on multiple scales. And I worry that the notion of community that's invoked may be too simple. This is my problem. Living under a racial order makes one sensitive about borders and boundaries and belonging. I also feel bound, in our discussion at least, to ask whether the idea of democracy is capable of connecting our adaptation to the crisis engulfing the planet with the possibilities of its salvage and possible redemption via Africa, large areas of which, so the systems scientists tell us, are soon likely to be uninhabitable. The intensifying climate emergency makes it unlikely that the decisions that will have to be taken to save human life and other life will be made on the basis of any democracy at all. And that failure testifies to the lack of imagination among political leadership. Given the fragility of international legal institutions, it's difficult for me to see that rights could be awarded or invested productively to dissolve the boundaries between humans, things, and other kinds of life. And as emergency conditions proliferate, it's especially difficult to see how people might be persuaded of the citizenship to be enjoyed by elks or rivers or fish or trees. Now, compounded by the COVID pandemic, the American summer of 2020 revealed the deadly routines of racial hierarchy and injustice and inequality, Camera phones and timeline media made that violence resonate planetarily, inviting solidarity, circulating interpretations to which the dynamics of racism were absolutely fundamental, and those murderous effects became visible. For a moment, the empathic repair of this ailing colonial world began to look possible in the light of a resulting revelation. And a very lively public sphere was one byproduct of that novel technological resource. I suppose collateral damage from the growing market in attention. That ethical, political, and juridical quake would prove fundamental in the planetary dissemination of information about the destruction and mass killing in Gaza. Now, this is just to think with as I proceed. The idea of a distinct black radical tradition has become extremely popular with younger thinkers and activists. So between Equiano and the Equiano cable, we traced the black radical tradition in its afterlife. It was one of Cedric Robinson's inventions from the year he spent in rural England writing Black Marxism, if you're familiar with that book. And the concept is not so much a canonical inventory of what anti-slavery or post-enslavement black radicals wrote and said. Robinson affirmed a consciousness common among the violently dispersed Africans that extended beyond their refusal of racial slavery and their resignation to it. So the concept identifies pre- and anti-colonial political action that was considered incomprehensible by European witnesses. Grounded in a humane counter-ontology, this oppositional dissenting mentality was alive in New World struggles against enslavement and the plantation nomos, as well as in movements that resisted colonial conquest, colonial government. Now, Robinson's intervention directs readers towards the formation of forces intent on undoing colonial power, on refusing racial hierarchy, on destroying their corresponding forms of economic and political exploitation, on remaking the world. And the opposition might appear in familiar outlines, but for him, its origins and purpose lie deep in the epistemologies, cosmologies, and faiths of people formed outside Europe and often against Europe. We can talk about the sources of that argument perhaps in discussion later. I haven't got time to do that now. Rather than being content with the facile proposition that cruelty, humiliation, and spectacular violence are in themselves the ends and sources of racial domination, Robinson channeled the interpretation of those processes towards a kind of relentless planetary machinery of capitalism with which they were so densely and multiply entangled. As capitalism rose, as it became dominant, and finally as it faltered, as it stagnated, and as it declined. And that sequence is in step with a history of destruction evident in our despoiled biosphere and the decadent social and civic relations that have allowed that spoliation to pass without comment or intervention for the most part. Of course, the power that some humans exercise triumphantly over the natural world is connected to the ways in which people controlled each other through the modern political idea of racial difference. So a better understanding of the mutual articulation requires dealing with the expansive, universalistic, and cosmopolitan alternatives that have come really from the colonial contact zones. Work like Achille's, one thinks also of Graeber and Wengrow's recent work on the indigenous critique. But Achille is really astute in that this gesture requires accommodating the cosmologies of non-European peoples swept up in the military mesh of the North Atlantic Basin's planetary dominion, and we must discover whether those residues can be revived, reactivated as resources for contemporary struggles to repair, to recover, to redeem. And that necessitates close and symptomatic reading of the obfuscated archives of colonial and imperial rule, where we discover persistently traces of this Robinson's primary object, these unassimilable oppositional responses to conquest and enslavement. Well, I want to convey something of my amendment to that tradition by summoning a few additional ancestors I've selected for it. And the first of these is June Jordan, known, I imagine, to some of you as a feminist essayist and poet whose still too little known work in many fields promises much for the future of the movement to humanize and democratize the world in the spirit of political ecology and reparative environmentalism. Her writing insists that we must pursue a world without racial hierarchy, where imperialism and militarism and fraternalism and male domination are no longer structuring features of social and political and institutional life. And the feminist politics and letters with which she's generationally affiliated includes modernist writers, people like Adrienne Rich, Situatedness has been mentioned, drawn from Virginia Woolf, yes, but even if their poetry has very distinctly different North American lines of descent. Other writers like Alice Walker, Tony Cade, whose experimental inclinations and references were tempered by their immersion and discomfort alongside June Jordan in the US Black Arts movement. And of course, they were all colleagues in the same English department at the City College in New York, where their co-workers included luminaries of the black aesthetic, like Audre Lorde and Barbara Christian, Addison Gale and David Henderson, all of whom merit being discussed, but not this morning. So Jordan's poetry has really been lauded, but her political writing has not yet found its time. And she was an early advocate for the rhetorical and ontic value of black vernacular English, something that drew a lot of criticism towards her, as well as an eloquent prosecutor of white supremacist violence meted out by the forces of law and order. She was known as an acute commentator on the politics of South Africa, before it became a thing. That's a joke, by the way. Lebanon, Nicaragua, and, of course, the intractable conflicts in her own homeland. She insisted repeatedly that South African and Palestinian peoples possess a human right to sanctuary on this planet, unquote. Jordan's very combative stance with regard to the articulation of gender relations with other forms of subordination and suffering remains, for me, inspiring in ways that the drier rhetoric of intersectionality, derived from imminent critiques of judicial reasoning, can't really do. She was a partisan intellectual for whom there were no boundaries in the planetary pursuit of freer, more equitable, and emphatically post-colonial relations, forms of autonomy, forms of liberty, and that are very difficult to name yet, which appear on every scale, from the most intimate sexual and interpersonal dimensions of love and life to the epic and the geopolitical. Now, in 1987, I was really privileged to share a platform with her and Daniel Cohn-Bendit, Martin Ryle, to discuss the necessary and inevitable rise of what was then called green politics, by which we meant a political ecology that could speak to the future of the Earth. And we agreed that the concern with the sustainability of life and well-being was not an effect of privilege lived behind overdevelopment's fortified wall. We shared a critical view of insatiable and reckless capitalism, and we knew that its transformation would require the renunciation of growth and all simplistic ideas of progress. And we needed to work less, we knew that, to work differently, yes, to use things rather than consume them, to have things that were not designed to break, and to face up to the difficult tasks involved in reintegrating culture with everyday life. There's a kind of platform here for what one writer in this tradition calls an alternative hedonism. Now, we didn't require a theory of the Anthropocene to see how the earth and the oceans were imperiled, or to appreciate the formative impact of colonial power and toxicity, despoliation and decay all around us. Enlightened Europe's special inability to act holistically demanded detailed explanation. For me, acting locally while thinking planetarily meant attending to some of the Caribbean voices emanating from dense tropical vegetation. And that sublime and challenging ecosystem displaced the arborescent thinking of philosophy's temperate zone. Differently forested, torrid environments were accorded profound metaphysical significance by the likes of Glissant Césaire has been mentioned, Wilson Harris Mittelholzer, many other poets and painters of the tempest and the rainforest and the jungle and the swamp. And I want to note a couple in particular, the contributions of African Americans like Robert Hayden and Henry Dumas, the brightest expositor of the differential racialization of riparian spaces, as well as the better-known efforts of his editor, Toni Morrison, whose envisioning of landscape supplies a kind of index of the novel forms of rootedness that were midwifed in the partial undoing of the US racial order. I have more to say about the Mississippi floods of 1927, but I'm worried about the time. All of that had a very profound effect on the popular culture and music of that country. Think of Bessie Smith's Backwater Blues, or think of Marvin Gaye with Mercy Me, the Ecology, marking a later phase. And those floods prompted fictional responses that saw the disaster as augmented by segregation and the half-life of enslavement. Here I'm thinking of Richard Wright's The Man Who Saw a Flood, and the pastoral womanism of Hurston's Their Eyes Are Watching God. Very typical, of course, that book featuring the September 1928 Okeechobee hurricane as an agent. And there is an animism in all this too, evident in a host of vernacular music like Louis Jordan's Chickens or Aretha Franklin's Every Natural Thing. The point is that writers and musicians build upon material willed to them by people struggling to distinguish themselves from racialized brutes lodged at the junction of animals with humankind. And there's no consensus over how to interpret the connections between the cruel exploitation of racial inferiors and the wider assaults on nature initiated by plantation cultivation. Now, June Jordan's book, Civil Wars, was a collection of her old essays that she remixed and recontextualized by introducing pointed comic autobiographical insertions. It composed appreciative testimony to the ethico-political importance of loving disagreement and principled divergence of opinion among friends. And she had been an activist in the Southern Freedom movement before training as an architect and urban planner in New York and Rome. And though we can't really be sure about how that education fitted into the development of what I could call her eco-political sensibilities, I think it must have been a significant factor in the articulation of what I want to call, against her objection, the utopian commitment she showed to social transformation, with pronounced environmental aspects. So the catalyst for her turn seems to have been provided by the Harlem Riot of 1964. Which erupted after a pattern of violence that's impossibly familiar now. James Powell, an unarmed 15-year-old African-American, is shot by a white police officer, and other deaths and injuries follow. Hundreds of demonstrators are arrested, and she writes about this, Jordan writes about this in a letter to a friend of hers. The cops shot from a kneeling commando comic book posture in the middle of 7th Avenue. We only wanted to pay homage to the kid the policeman had murdered. It was a bloody shock. The cops kept shooting and shooting. People lay all over the street crying in pain. At one point, the cops forced some of us up against the store window and the window collapsed. I was so scared I could hardly breathe. Well, in response to the riot, Jordan worked with her friend. She calls him mentor. I don't really believe in mentors, so I don't know what to think about that. The futuristic architect, mathematician, and engineer R. Buckminster Fuller. And they worked together in a plan to rebuild and improve Harlem. She told him, actually, I should have switched slides. There's a picture of her going off to study. She told him that most Harlem tenements were 6 stories up. So the two of them planned to create a new city above the old city. And here I acknowledge the work of Cheryl Fish, who, as far as I know, is the only critic who have championed these elements of Bucky and June's work. That's the first. It's a very bad quality slide, but you get an idea of what they were planning. So in 1965, they wrote an essay in Esquire entitled Skyrise for Harlem. And when the piece was published, the editors had taken her name off it and altered the title to Instant Slum Clearance. And in a letter she wrote to Bucky Fuller, she said, "We conceived this environmental redesign as a form of federal reparation to the ravaged people of Harlem." And the scheme involved the denizens of Harlem being liberated from the brutalism of the city's grid by these massive spiral structures you can see. Spatial and environmental change was going to prompt new ways of dwelling in opposition to the racially segregated, anti-human, but automobile-friendly environment of New York City. So these conical structures enclose curving roads and winding ramps. It's a bit like the stadium in Soweto, where there are no steps, so the ramps go up. The confinement dictated by the linear order of grids and blocks has been disposed of, and the ascent of people, the going upwards, would be combined with a transformation of the interior and exterior space of the city. So Jordan's blueprint for a new Harlem planned these green spaces and lifted the area's earthbound tenements up into the sky. And that upward momentum is also a way to raise the neighborhood's common mentality out of its depression. So she insisted on the practical character of this. She wouldn't call it utopian. And the Esquire article declared that the Harlem Riot generated a profusion of remedies, but nowhere was environmental redesign given any emphasis. So displacing, that's the interior of the structure. You see the ramp going up. Displacing grid thinking, Jordan's plan purges the area of 90-degree corners, junctions associated with bad housing, but also with drug dealing and selling sex. And during the reconstruction process, the residents were to stay in their old homes, and then they would migrate upwards into the new ones, and free up an enormous amount of ground underneath for recreation and so forth, parking, etc. Now, Jordan's reflections on her own difficult personal circumstances at this moment show that she still considered her own automobile as a tangible liberty. And that antisocial attachment to the car would begin to change as her sense of the destructive impact of automobiles on urban ecology became more elaborate. And the extent of this change can be gauged from a novel that she wrote around these themes in 1971. It was written in vernacular black American English to a storm of criticism that she was using vernacular English and selling the young people as school students short as a result. That book is called His Own Where. Its two principal characters, it's a very potted version, I apologize. The two principal characters are young lovers from, quote, the small-scale broken land of Brooklyn, unquote. Buddy's father is dying in hospital after being hit by a car, and Jordan makes Buddy's feelings about the environment very plain. I can't read this in the African-American vernacular, so please forgive me for my English. Cars make Buddy mad. Right now, his father lying in the hospital from what they call accident. And was no accident about it, Buddy realized. The street's set up that way so cars can clip the people easy, kill them even, easy. There's a bit of stuff about corners, but I'll cut that out. Buddy begins to garden with his friend and lover. He liked the feel of soil under his fingernails and mud changing shape in the palm of a hand or the slight shiver of a slow-moving earthworm. He makes the backyards on his block into a communal garden and nudges his neighbors into new kinds of conversation on the street. Then he starts to transform the interior space of the dying family home, and the couple make a new, then it's abandoned, and the couple make a new dwelling in a parcel of wasteland in the city before settling down in a cemetery where they start to imagine alternative ways of living and loving. Certainly, Jordan retains the hopes for social and spatial transformation that have been evident in the Harlem Plan. Let me quote from her. I will not pretend, this is from an essay she wrote after this, I will not pretend that it is privacy and fame and quiet that I want, and what I need is a sanitary, safe and reliable subway or public bus system, an attractive apartment I can rent, and then, as often as possible at night, I want and I need an ostensible stranger who will lie beside me, becoming someone I love as much, at least, as I love myself. Now, she also credits Buckminster Fuller with another change that helped, she says, to free her from her festering racial anger. When I was still a young woman, she writes, I asked my friend and mentor Buckminster Fuller about several wristwatches that he always wore simultaneously. He described to me his incessant global peregrinations and explained his wish to ascertain easily what time it might be anywhere on the planet. I listened to him puzzled and without envy, but why, I wondered, would anyone travel like that? Didn't he have a home? Didn't home matter to him? A man is not a tree, he told me. And in the decades since that conversation, I have gradually and the hard way comprehended what he meant. The whole world will become a home to all of us, or none of us can hope to live on it peacefully, unquote. Now I'll conclude. Well, capitalism is in a catabolic state. It emancipated itself from existing varieties of democracy, but that freedom has only intensified the chronic crisis that is now the norm. And the system's would-be gravediggers will have to construct modes of mutual accountability on several scales, up to and including the planetary. Across the borders, boundaries, and fortifications that divide the overdeveloped world from the indebted and developmentally arrested zones, the more vulnerable from the less, the third world from the others. I prefer to promote in response to this the prospect of conviviality, common dwelling, and cooperative responses to the trials and demands of alterity. And those skills, I think, have to be cultivated prefiguratively as an ethical resource, as well as a political technique, oriented towards a distant, multifaceted, not yet democracy on the foundation, perhaps, of what Dussel called analogical pluriversality. Now, those outcomes are made less likely by deeply entrenched anti-intellectualism, by proliferating functional illiteracy, old foes that have acquired new leases of psychopolitical life as parts of the ubiquitous culture of denial that is toxic to democracy. And together they support the mystification and the fatalism that lift concerns about the climate crisis out of the field of political action and divert them into the adjacent terrain of anxiety and inertia. Fatalists accept there's nothing that can be done about the horrors in our common future, so they do nothing. And there is a debate to be had about the responsibility and morality of acting on the worst-case scenario. But I suggest that we should resist the extravagant wisdom of strategies of social palliation. Those responses forsake agonistic democracy and attempt instead to make a private virtue either of accommodation or of resignation. The efficient mass killing publicly enacted in Gaza similarly presents the powerlessness of intellectuals and intelligentsia, unable to hide from the simple truth of what has unfolded there, even though it continues a pattern stretching back many decades and has, against the odds, been comprehensively documented. Here again, the mechanisms of denial enter and demand from us that we pretend what is happening is not what it appears to be. That failure is a profound thing. It exposes not only the evisceration and disposal of democratic culture of universal human rights erected in the middle of the 20th century, but the unwholesome core of formal democracy is revealed by its shocking acquiescence in a double standard that is always at the heart of colonial history and its eugenic machinations. We will all of us, suffer from that world historic change in the political, legal, moral conventions of democracy. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Paul Gilroy. There will now be a break until 11:05, which will give us 20 minutes. And for the break, please go down to the Café Christie for refreshments down below. When you return, if we believe what Professor Arto Quaison said, there might be a total change in here. You might come into an alternative universe. But hopefully, it will involve at least our 3 symposiasts and the Holberg Laureate and me on stage. So welcome back, 11:05. Thank you. Welcome back, everyone. Could you all please find your seats, please? Excellent. I think we should start with giving the symposiasts and Professor Achille a round of applause before we start our discussion. Now, it was a very rewarding first half of the symposium, and we've had the symposiasts outline a number of responses, I think, to your title, Achille, Democracy as a Community of Life. And I would just like to start by offering you a chance to respond. I don't know if you feel critiqued or engaged or extrapolated upon or misunderstood, but I would like for you to start by providing a response.
First of all, I have to thank Atto and Paul and Nasrin for what they offered us. I'm not going to respond to the many intimations and new lines of inquiries that they have put on the table. I take it that this is an unfolding project, and that this is just the first step in a discussion, conversation that will have to keep going on. It has started long ago. It's taking now probably what one hopes is a new inflection. I was, of course, extremely excited at listening to Atto's engagement with Amos Tutuola and the ways in which he developed his notion of delirious sovereignty. I was joking with Professor Jan Bokkom a moment ago. You know, Tutuola's book is My Life in the Bush of the Ghosts. And then he said, you know, Trump in the Bush of the Ghosts, something like that. So I was very interested in that rereading of Tutuola as part of a broader effort to rediscover the depth of what I call the African archive. I understand, Paul, of course, how couldn't I, when he invites us to pay serious attention to the, what he called it, the catabolic nature, not only of capitalism, but of what he usually terms the world racial order. We, of course, have to do that. And that's what he tried to do in the short, that has been his life project, thank God. I think that for those of us who somewhat try to read that world from the African continent, there is a chance we have that our archive is somewhat deeper than, let's say, the that catabolic moment of the racial. and of capitalist forms of enslavement. After all, I mean, it all started there. The paradox of Africa is that we are the oldest continent, the oldest human formation in the world, and very soon also the youngest. That we will bring together these two, we will, I mean, bring the circle back to where it all began. And while others are, you know, looking forward to the sun going down, the sun, literally and metaphorically, will be rising in Africa. It will be rising, as see again, Paul, the map. Du Bois' cover with Africa at the center, sun coming. I have in mind the maps you were telling me about this morning as a result of the climatic catastrophe we are already in, which will definitely make huge chunks of the continent uninhabitable. Therefore, the question of livability, habitability, futures of life, etc. But I want to pay attention to what it is that we can draw from these deep resources which have not always been taken seriously. Because the continent for too long, to cite the gospel, have been akin to that stone the builders have discarded. So what happens if we take back that stone and make of it the cornerstone of the building, of the common roof you were referring to? Now, in that process, I mean, what name do we give to such a project? Of course, it can be given many, many different names. I know the extent to which the idea of conviviality, the place it plays in your thinking. And many of us have been running with it. It has given us a lot of joy and impetus. So if we don't want to call it democracy, or if we don't want to qualify the form of democracy it invokes, a democracy, to quote Derrida, which is in fact yet to come. In fact, it will always be, if you want, ahead of us. That kind of democracy, substantive, which is in fact of the order of a horizon, because there will never be a time when we'll say, yes, here we are. It will always be calling for us, because placed in advance of any event. So if we don't want to call it democracy, does it mean that then some of the key signifiers of what the idea of democracy has stood for have also to be discarded? I am not sure. Maybe I'm wrong, but I want to feel that moment when I'm wrong. I really want to get to that point where, oh no, this was totally useless. It didn't mean anything. Let's leave it aside and go somewhere else. So it seems to me that's a question we have to keep open. We have to keep coming back to it. The same, of course, with the concept of community, especially in the African continent. We know what has happened. Folklorized, as Bjorn was telling me a moment ago, commodified. But when we put all of that aside and undertake the the critical, demanding work of getting rid of what Mbembe has called the colonial library, to put in its place a planetary library of the kind you call for, which you did this morning, which Atto did, which Nasrim did, assembling, recomposing all of these texts and sources. If we undertake that kind of demanding labor, it seems to me that there is still something to be saved from, let's say, all these received wisdom, in any case, in the African archive. So that's not a response. It's just to say how deeply I have been affected by what I heard this morning, and which I take as another step in the long conversation intergenerational we have been having.
Great, thank you for that initial response, Achille. And perhaps we can start there with this notion of democracy and the notion of community, and put it on the table for Nasreen and Arto and Paul to respond. Because, as you yourself said, Achille, I mean, we are perhaps emerging towards a new kind of geopolitics where you have the computational rises, there is a kind of a molecular politics to the biology of the planet, and it seems pretty stark in some of your thoughts on the future of the planet as well. So in terms of the future of democracy, the future of community, I mean, do we need to rethink? Do we need to rebrand? Do we need to go back to ideas of prefiguration, that there are aspects of our countries or our communities or collectives that sort of separate and regenerate and sequester? Or should we hold on to inclusive and perhaps somewhat stale notions of democracy and community in your views? I don't know, perhaps we could start with you, Nasrin.
So I'll just put an idea on the table. One thing I was trying to articulate in my reading of Beauvoir and Fanon is, you know, in post-human thought like Glissant's work or Deleuze and Guattari, you have a move from being to becoming. You have a move, you know, to relation. And I think that this move actually comes from feminist and anti-racist critique. It's implicit in the way that form of thought had to critique non-relation, all these colonial and patriarchal forms of non-relation. So there was already a reach there for relation. But I guess one question that interests me is what would it mean if we did move from a politics of identity to a politics of relation? What kind of citizens, what form of personhood would we have to think about? And what also might be lost, you know, in that move, because the politics of identity gives us a capacity to speak to forms of racism, forms of sexism in a very specific way. And so one thing that that I'm certainly interested in is this community of life, this form of, you know, thinking the politics of relation. What are the advantages and disadvantages of thinking that way, and what examples in the world can we think of that that exemplify something like a community based on relation? Well, I think, you know, feminist and anti-racist thought is precisely the kind of community that might give us examples.
Great. Arto, would you like to respond?
Well, let me take a slightly different approach, and which is to think of the different modalities of identification, empathetic identification, generated or made available by different kinds of stories or narratives. Mm-hmm. So if you did a literary history of storytelling, you would start from oral storytelling of the tutuola variety, which normally implies an audience, Oedipus, and oral accounting, and so on. And the lessons, the lesson plan in that kind of storytelling was somewhat moralistic, but it also gave emblematic ideas about the universe and the earth and so on. And the audience were participants in the co-creation of that universe. So the oral storyteller did not have the dominion or absolute control of the story. They could be corrected from the audience. And then we jumped in very quickly to the universe opened up by the television soap opera, where the television soap opera is a particular form of narrativization which pauses or ends on the cliffhanger, but which then continues, and the point of the cliffhanger is to elicit our return. So that's the objective of the soap opera. And then we have the gladiatorial, they may not seem like gladiatorial context, but they are Big Brother or Blind Date or, Love Island, any number of, or Bachelors, Bachelor, Bachelorette, and so on. These are gladiatorial narratives because ultimately the audience is being invited to support one person as opposed to another, and to hope that their person wins. And of course, the format of it is such that it allows for one's allegiance, the viewer's allegiance, to shift very quickly from a loser to a potential winner. These are different narrative forms that induce or elicit forms of identification. By the time we get to social media, what has now happened is that social media surrenders or delivers the forms of production to us all. All of us can take a picture of our soggy burger, put it up on Facebook, and invite likes. So I don't need to identify with you, your sorry burger. You identify with me, and if you're lucky, I'll also identify with you. Now, the social media, it's a mistake to think that social media has abolished those other forms of narrative identification, empathetic identifications. But what has happened is that the scale of it, and also because social media has been corralled by capital, and nothing is more scary than, or is more scary than Elon Musk owning the platform formerly known as X. Oh no, it was formerly known as Twitter. It's the other way. The platform formerly known as Twitter. Nothing is more scary than the confusion that is causing in my own mind. But the point is that because capitalism has yoked itself to these platforms, it seems, and the word here, operational word, it seems to have abrogated the other forms of narrativizations, which are still extant. They are still present. I think part of the archive building is to make space for those different forms of narratives. It's not a simple case of let 1,000 narratives bloom, but it's an intentional specification of the affordances allowed or enabled by these different forms of narratives as a counter to what has really been the corralling of social media by the algorithm and capitalism.
Thanks for that. Paul, would you like to respond?
One thing I want to say to Achille is that I wasn't disagreeing, actually, about the need to fight strategically for the defense of democracy. I started from that point, so I don't disagree. But I do worry that democracy isn't the right way, and you have shown in your own work so elegantly and so powerfully that it's worth trying to imagine other vocabularies, other concepts, that derive from that other library, that other archive. So I think we agree about that. On the question of what you do when you get away from identity and you posit relationality as first philosophy, I mean, obviously, what's being excluded from that conversation in the way it came out in our conversation so far is that there is, particular traditions of, I think, of Jewish philosophy that do that and have done that very powerfully, but which, if we believe Edward Said and if we believe the critiques of Emmanuel Levinas, found the question of how to turn the general other into the concrete other in the form of Palestinian, it was an impossible demand to reconcile. So I would want to cite that force, that biblical force, and I know, Achille, you alluded to the stone that the builder refuses. So there is a kind of biblical dimension to some of your choices in poetics, which is worth perhaps bringing into this conversation, because for a lot of people here and elsewhere, it's religion that usually manages that role. And I personally am very invested in the question of who is my neighbor. I really am invested in that question, as is Chuck Taylor, as is, Ivan Illich, and a whole range of people who have inspired me. So I think that's a great question. Who is my neighbour? And it's one to be asked here, I think, in such an empty country with lots and lots of space. This is a good question. Who is my neighbour? And on what scale is that question going to be answered? Now, the other thing is, that so far, I think, in our conversation, the word empathy is being thrown around in a way that I'm a little uncomfortable with. I know I keep saying I'm a little uncomfortable with this word, I'm a little uncomfortable with that word. I have, this is my own neurodiversity. I have problems with words. So I just want to say that I want to make a claim here for sympathy. I want to speak not about empathy, which is a newer word and has a very particular history that we need to engage. I want to speak up for sympathy, because in the context of Black Atlantic and abolitionist struggles going back to the 18th century and so on, sympathy played an important role, not least in the gendering of the written idioms in which these stories were narrated and so on. And, speaking as someone who's a sort of cack-handed musician, let me say that there is a sense of a sympathetic string, a string that vibrates in relation to other strings and so on, that so I think there's a sonic, or the question of reverberation enters into my thinking about how these things might be transmitted. And of course, empathy, if you look it up in the dictionary, suggests that, and this is, makes it an odd thing for people to be so invested in, an empathetic relationship with something is to actually inhabit or experience that thing as the other person experiences it. Mm-hmm. I'm not so optimistic as that, actually. Whereas the sympathy, which is the older vocabulary, suggests that a fragment or a portion or a sufficient amount of that is transmitted. And that's enough. And it's enough for me because that's where the politics is, and or at least that's where it's been so far. So the critique of identity might also include arguments, not least from, some portions of Californian feminism, where the idea of identity was interrogated in relation to the idea of affinity, and affinity suggested other possibilities of political collective acting and so on. One thinks of Donna Haraway crawling into the nuclear test site with her affinity group, the surrogate others, if you can cast your mind back that far, and to the formation of the political subject of women of colour, which was part of the argument that she made in her essay about cyborgs. So I think I want to bat for sympathy. I want to bat for affinity. I want to suggest that one of the other big gains we might make if we were able to meet the challenge that Nasreen outlined was to actually be less invested in militaristic understandings of political change and political conflict, and that there is an explicit body of political work to be engaged in the demilitarization of our understanding of the world and of conflict, ways of managing conflict. Here I know I sound a bit sort of, fluffy, but that's not my intention. I think that we have to engage militarization in our institutions, in our thinking, in our disciplines, in the life of universities in a much more thoroughgoing and explicit way. And of course, we look to Norway to do that because Norway has led so many of these conversations in other areas in the past in the interests of a larger planetary community. On the point of social media, I mean, I agree with what Atta said, but I think that he's about 3 generations behind on social media, and that really we need to be thinking about the political work that's been accomplished through TikTok and things like that, which is anathema to me, but which is actually, if you want to understand what's going on with the camps that spring up on universities everywhere, and if you want to understand how forms of sympathy are disseminated worldwide, you have to deal with the, with the generic attributes of TikTok as a communicative medium, and they're not, the relationship to narrative is still there, but it's a very attenuated relationship to narrative. So that's what I'll say.
Thanks so much for your responses to Achille's immediate thought. We have here from being to becoming and towards the relational, we have the importance of the narrative, and we have your point, Paul, about sympathy, not empathy. And in a sense, some of this seems to resonate with your kind of thinking, Achille. I mean, you're thinking of going back to the archives that we haven't really looked at as a common humanity, in a sense. The archive of African cosmogonies, the archives of colonization, and these kind of repositories of human knowledges and experiences. And just to challenge you in some way, Achille, in terms of you wanting to revisit and use African cosmogonies as an archive, as a resource, as a point for, I don't know, rebooting of the human sounds a bit cliche, but I mean, anyway, rethinking of the human in today's context of the Anthropocene. You seem to indicate, for instance, in your work that we should draw on these African myths. They do seem to indicate, these myths, that there is no clear relation between human and animal, human and spirit, matter and human, etc., etc. So this seems to be at odds, for instance, with the notion from Paul about sort of sympathy, not empathy, in a sense. Yeah? Would you agree with that? And also, what is the relation from that starting point to Nasreen's argument about becoming, not being, and Arto's point about the importance of narration? I just want you to reflect on this.
Let's say that I'm trying to find a way of cutting a long story short. Most of the studies we do have, because a lot has been done in anthropology and history in particular. It might not be known in the general public, but it does exist. We have at least a century, 2 centuries of work, of excavation, of these metaphysics, to put it quickly. Now, when one undertakes to read those texts seriously, it appears that the kinds of original dichotomies one finds in dominant traditions of Western thought, those dichotomies either don't exist, or if they do, they work in entirely different modalities. They work in the sense that there is a recognition of kind of foundational multiplicity of everything. Currencies, you have as many currencies as you want. Forms of marriage, you have as many forms of marriage as possible. Forms of trade, political formations from the most hydraulic kingdoms to empires to so-called segmentary societies, everything comes under the form of multiplicity. And therefore, let's say, the work, le travail, intellectual, political, social, cultural work consists precisely in knowing how to put together this composite reality, how to assemble that which apparently seems to be completely contradictory. That's the work, the labor of knowledge, the labor of social composition. It's about composition, compositional logics, which produce efficacy, because that's how you obtain what you are looking for, and which produce legitimacy. Because legitimacy doesn't arise from discriminating. It emerges out of that capacity to put together forms of multiplicity. So, are we then here in the domain of sympathy? Mm-hmm. Partly, yes. Sympathy, I would argue, in the sense of knowing full well that in the other, there is a part of me that is at stake. When I see Atto, when I look at Atto, and I look at his face, to use the trope, a Levinasian trope, since Paul is inviting us to do so, I see a part of me in Atto. Atto is somewhat like my mirror, that I look at him and I see part of my own face. And in fact, that part of the energy or the vital soul, which is part of my person, some of it is active in his. So there is a possibility of communion, or in any case, of proximity, but really deep proximity between us. So that if I harm him, I'm harming part of myself. So you have all of that, I mean, in myths, in legends. So it's an entirely different approach, where indeed the key issue is not like in Western metaphysics. It's not about being. It's not about ontology, being in and of itself. It's about relation. You start from the belief, fundamental belief that you are, via the set networks of connections and relations and co-inhabitations, out of which emerges a provisional subject or entity who is called upon to keep metamorphosizing as into Tuola. So I could go on and on and on. No, there's not enough time. But I guess you see the implications, political implications in terms of our connection to new technologies, for instance. I really believe that, in fact, new media technologies are African fundamentally, if indeed that's how we describe what I'm talking about, but I'll stop there.
Atto, please.
Okay, so two quick things, actually three, but I'll leave the third one out. Because of the empathy, sympathy continuum. So the example you gave about looking at me, and I hope it's not because of our clean-shaven heads, seeing a part of you, that's empathetic.
There's something missing.
There's something missing. Okay. But what you said toward the end about the relationality of the African being, to this day, African traditions, medical traditions, so traditional medicine, if you go to a traditional medicine man or woman, and you have an ailment that appears incurable, the first question they will ask you is, who have you quarreled with? That you have to go and repair the social damage before you come to, because you are a being that is relational. So they don't see your symptoms as exclusively yours. The symptoms that you are showing are actually in relation to your social relation. If you have impaired social relations, you also be sick. To this day, African traditions of medicine. The second thing is the non-schematic character of African thought. When the Yorubas, when the Christians across the continent were translating indigenous languages into European languages for the Bible, one of the challenges that they faced was how to find a correlative for Satan. So among the Yorubas, in the Yoruba, cosmogony, they don't have, Satan does not exist. So when the Yorubas, when the Christian missions, the Church Missionary Society, they're called, was casting about for a translation of Satan, they settled upon Eshu. But Eshu is not Satan. Eshu is a trickster figure. And Eshu is supposed to articulate the principle of undecidability in the universe. And that something you can see as black might be white tomorrow. And this principle, he's also God of crossroads. So he's God of metamorphosis, God of crossroads, and of changeability. But the Yoruba Bible translated Satan as Eshu. So Eshu, in the biblical tradition, is anti-God. He's been schematized and assigned a role which is ethically deficient. But in the larger society, the trickster figure is one of regard, is to understand that a society is pluriverse. Everything is or the universe is pluriversal, and so on and so forth, and that there are things that you need to account for. So Christianity, and which of course Christianity is a major source of what is called secularism. The secular laws that govern governments and so on are actually Christian laws. And that is why a country like France can say that to veil, not to show your face, is somehow non-secular. It makes absolutely no sense that if you cover your face is something unsecular. But in fact, the principle governing that is a Christian idea, that you have to be completely naked before the eye of God. Replace the surrogate of which is the eye of the state. So because you have to be completely naked before the eye of God, which is whose surrogate is the eye of the state, to veil yourself is to be non-secular. It's religious. So that's the second thing. The final thing is that as we've come to, set up nation states and bureaucratic rationality, bureaucratic logics, we have come to separate us. We've come to grow further and further from the archives that we spoke of, because the archives, and I'm thinking specifically of our political leaders, they say they don't know how to translate. So they translate in terms of national cloth. So on big occasions, they wear the national cloth. But their translational facility fails because they've actually been completely co-opted by a Western mode of thought and the ideals of governmentality. And it's not just that they are failing to translate outwards. They are also obfuscating. They are rendering all kinds of unclarities to their own people. So that leads to a kind of gap displacement, because the way the governmental authorities speak is so distanced from the way ordinary people understand, except, of course, when it comes to elections, where they simplify the matter as simply casting a vote.
Thanks for that. You seem to indicate here, and I think this resonates with all of you on stage, the need to, how should I put it, unrulify archives and expand human archives in order to rethink community, rethink the human, and rethink life as such. Would you like to respond to any of this, Achille, or
no, I think Paul, I saw Paul taking some notes.
If not, we will open the floor for some questions from the audience. So, so please, when there is my colleague Ellen here with a microphone and Vanessa over there. So when you state your question, please state your name first and please be brief.
Yeah. Sari Hanafi, Professor of Sociology at American University of Beirut. Congratulations, Professor Mbembe. In the rationale of this symposium, there is a question, what kind of democracy? What kind of democracy or what kind of liberal democracy? I mean, I feel you omit the word liberal. And this a little bit worry me. Because I don't see alternative to liberal democracy, but we can improve it because it's in a crisis. We can add convivial, etc. I mean, I know in the liberal era, it is the colonial era and the global warming era, but also the era of resistance. And while we walk in here, we saw the encampment against the genocide, the current genocide in Gaza. I've been 2 days ago in University of Oslo encampment. I talk with activists where I notice how they resist against global warming, feminist, in favor of LGBTQ, but in favor of liberation of Palestine. So, if you like, this liberal democracy also generate a new discourse, not necessarily new power. So here, where I would like you to comment whether we should remove this word liberal, or we can see hope within this bloody liberal democracy that with young generations.
Thanks a lot. We'll have some responses from the symposiasts. Achille, would you like to start? Or?
No, because I would like to give the opportunity to my fellows. I will speak tomorrow. I'll give a lecture tomorrow. So,
okay.
Don't tease us.
Okay. Okay. So I think we should give the floor to Paul, and then Nasreen, and then Atto. Yeah, Paul.
Well, does liberal democracy incubate other possibilities, other future possibilities? Hard to name, yes. But I mean, is it possible at this point to be able to know what the final shape of that will be, or what it is to make a democracy on a planetary scale, which is what we're being asked to address here today? Because we know if we do that in this world institution that's yet to come, will there even be one Norwegian in there? We know there'll be 60 people from China and a large number of people from South Asia will be in there, but I'd be surprised if there's going to be one Norwegian on the basis of population. So we have to think of other ways to imagine this, and that's why I tried to emphasize the question of imagination. On the point that you make about the protesters, the dissenters, conducting themselves, comporting themselves in ways that bring alternatives closer, I think that is absolutely the case for many of them. I don't even think that they are of one mind on that, but some of them, a large portion, are committed in their conduct to rehearsing the world they would like to see. And that's been, as Nasreen pointed out earlier on this morning, that's been a feature in particular of feminist politics for a very long time. I don't know. Yeah, I mean, obviously, I'm committed to that. I feel, though, that, you know, Achille's challenging us to get away from that scale of thinking about it. He's inviting us to think on a number of different scales simultaneously and see how they might interact with one another. And that's where I lose my way, because I don't know how those different scales are going to interact. I know that sociologists, once upon a time, before I was a recovering sociologist, I was acquainted with the stories that sociologists tell about the interrelationship between those different scales of action. I'm somewhat disenchanted with those stories now, because they acquire almost sort of theological aspect. So I think we need new stories about how those different scales of interaction interrelate. And I don't know whether they'll be narrative or what narrativity they might have, or whether they'll form other, demand other forms of contiguity, montage. You know, I often think of a dub aesthetic as a way of making sense of how these things might interact in future. I know that's a bit niche. I haven't got time to go into it now. But I mean, when Achille spoke earlier on about the radical multiplicity that arises when you really address the history of Africa in this story, I think that is a challenge, you know. But I'm not sure it's a challenge that escapes from the question, who is my neighbor? I think it's still hostage to that. And the forms of recognition involved in, you know, seeing the face of the other, you know, I mean, is really, I think, a minority preoccupation that runs, you know, from Montesquieu to Hegel through various feminist writers into the present, and that there's a whole generation of young people for whom the question of recognition is not the issue. That they think instead, where we think about recognition, they think about visibility, and there are all sorts of things that really relate to seeing themselves in the other, which is not the I in thou. It's seeing the self. It's myself in you. It's not the I and thou. So I think there's a different. This is a place where you have to have an intergenerational conversation, and where that conversation has to be generously engaged in, so that we translate each other's ideas in the optimal way, and we don't allow the luxury of drifting into supposing that, you know, bad faith and narcissism and nihilism are the governing principles of conversation. So I think an intergenerational conversation is fundamental to this calculation, and of course I applaud those people, those dissenters, who feel that they can embody the world they want to bring by conducting and comporting themselves in a different way.
Thank you. Nasreen?
So I'll just respond to this by saying I think some of the inspiring models we see within liberal-neoliberal democracies is, you know, when, for example, prisoners in California a few years ago articulated solidarity with Palestinians in the sense that they feel that the same structures of governance exist in Gaza as exist in the prison industrial complex. So these kinds of ways of thinking across cultures, across different national boundaries about solidarity, I think, is very important. And this connects up with Paul's point about, you know, what does it mean to move from empathy to sympathy? I think, you know, it's a key question. And do we have to recognize our face in the face of the other? I'm not sure that's exactly, you know, what is happening. Yes, they're recognizing certain similar structures, but can solidarity move from something like recognition to acknowledgement? And if we do move, is that the same as the move from from empathy to sympathy? You know, I think that lessening the need for me to fully comprehend the other or that situation, and thinking about how we might be related in ways that I don't fully comprehend. I mean, I think that's part of the move to relation. It's not that I have to know fully how I am intertwined in the other or in there. I don't have, it's not necessarily a knowledge-based practice in that sense. Non-relation is entirely obsessed with the question of who you are and producing that kind of knowledge. So I think that the question of how to make these kinds of connections within democratic society is key.
Great. Arto?
Well, I want to respond in terms of bringing back to the foreground the principle of economic redistribution, equitable economic redistribution. Because what has happened since at least the 1970s is that the labor union movement has been under retreat, worldwide. Margaret Thatcher's clash with the coal miners was exemplary of that phase. But everywhere, the labor and trade union movement, the gains that they achieved from capital, things like even the nature of pensions, the maternity leaves, and various protections, has been under onslaught. So the question is, if the trade union movement is in a bit of disarray, what is the other principle of economic redistribution that we have to achieve equity, not just within particular states, but planetary, at the global level? And it's not clear to me that we've actually figured out that the term liberal democracy by itself doesn't actually touch on the question of redistribution. Because the states think that the redistributive principle, the mechanism is through taxation. But as we know, taxation is chaotic. Trump bragged, he made it open, that this is in 2016, that he should be elected president because he's the only one who knows how to work the tax system in the United States. He's the one he doesn't pay any taxes. So if you want to know how it works, you have to, it's just obscene. But the point is that the principle of economic equity, equitable economic redistribution, we have to find an answer to it, given that the trade union movement, the labor movement, has been have been pounded since Reagan and Thatcher. I don't see that there's a clear discourse about what mechanisms to put in place for that redistribution to take place. So the economic question has to be put side by side alongside the liberal democracy question.
Thank you for that. I mean, our time is running out, as it were, but I mean, Achille, would you like to offer any sort of concluding thoughts to this issue of democracy, liberal democracy, and your symposiast's responses to the question posed by Professor Hanafi?
First of all, lovely to see you, Professor Hanafi. Last time was in Jerusalem, if I remember very well. No, I mean, there is no conclusion to be drawn yet. We just started. Maybe in Oslo we'll begin to draw a few conclusions. I think Paul was right to remind us that when he went on to the podium this morning, I think one of the first things he said was democracy is under siege, something to that effect. And he alluded to the necessity that it be defended. Foucault wrote, society must be defended. Maybe I need a new book, Democracy Must Be Defended. It is under siege, and we see it especially in Africa, where in fact, there's a confusion, first of all, between what the tenor of democracy is all about and its institutional, the institutional shape it might take in a given society at any given time. The fact is that in the continent, democracy, liberal democracy, is still really an aspiration. It's not yet a reality, except in a few places. But the aspiration for a life in societies that are open, societies that do care for each and everyone, that aspiration is absolutely real. It has been there for a very long time. So the kind of work some of us are involved in as we speak, and Bjorn mentioned this morning that I was involved in some work with the Innovation Foundation for Democracy. The work we are doing has to do with, first of all, a proper cartography of innovations that are actually taking place. That when we move away from the noise and the fog, people on the ground in various forms and localities are actually recreating, giving form to that aspiration for living decently in an environment in which everyone and everybody is included. So this involved the production of certain forms of knowledge on basis of methodologies which have to be, of course, revisited. What we also notice is the fact that we have to offer through a work of research, imagination, training, actual support, including financial, to small collectives. Imagine something that would look like substantive democracy. I'm not using the term liberal democracy. So if you look into debates going on in Africa right now, the idea of a substantive democracy is the one that is attracting a lot of attention and the object of lots of controversies. Now, the question is, to what extent is it that this substantive democracy people are trying to enact, to what extent is it different from liberal democracy? To what extent does it take into account the point Paul was mentioning this morning, agonistic democracies and Chantal Mouffe and the others? To what extent is it taking that into account, knowing full well that conflicts are part of actual social life in the continent? All of those questions are open-ended. And what is really interesting is that we are entering a new phase of social and cultural and intellectual experimentation, which is taking many, many different forms. In a context, too, which is very much characterized by the desire for many African countries to reassert some form of sovereignty, not in the abstract. Sovereignty, for instance, in Senegal, over natural resources. Oil has been discovered, gas is going to be exploited, fisheries are booming. How do we make sure that we exercise some form of control over these resources so that the exploitation might benefit us as at the same time as it benefits the investors? So you have all those questions that are being asked, and a huge aspiration, especially from young people, disenfranchised for the most part, a huge aspiration for fundamental transformation. Not transformation in the type of inertia elections, for instance, have produced. Many don't believe any longer that you can enact transformation by voting. So there are a number of propositions that are being put on the table. Some who say, oh, you want transformation? You have organized a coup d'etat. And in fact, in many of those countries, alternance, the change of regimes has been effectuated through coup d'etat. You have those who say, if you want transformation, you go and organize an armed struggle, you use violence. And those who say, look, deep transformation will happen through the enactment of substantive democracy. And you have to define what you mean by that. So it's a time of huge deliberations. And I think that's not a conclusion to our morning session, but I think it's a rejoinder to the call everybody has been making this morning for a renewal of the imagination, including epistemological imagination, the reopening of as many archives as possible, the archives of the whole world, as opposed to relying on just one sort of archive, the fact of connecting with as many different texts as possible, both from the continent and through the wider world. And I believe that it is that call for radical openness to the resources we have collectively amassed and created, which for me gives me joy as we open the week.
Thank you very much, Achille. I mean, we're running slightly late, but we have had an extraordinary, interesting discussion, I think. I mean, we could have also talked about the transmogrification of the human and what that means. We could have talked about the limits to what we accord life. We could have talked about the distribution and the relation between necropolitics and what we think of as democracy, all those things. But we have to end here, and I would really like to thank the symposiasts, Arto Quaison, Paul Gilroy, and Nasreen Ola for joining the Holberg Laureate Achille Mbembe here on stage. So just let's give them a round of applause. And last but not least, I want to thank the audience here who's joining us here live at the University Åla in Oslo, but also around the world for having participated. In the Åla now, there will be served some lunch here and below, I think, yes. And at 1 o'clock sharp here in University Åla, we will have the 2024 Nils Klim Symposium, with the 2024 Nils Klim Laureate Siddharth Sarin. So welcome back then, enjoy your lunch, and thank you all again.